Thank you for those in person, and welcome to the people online as well. Oh, I need to record the talk.
Thanks so much.
Okay. So the recording actually started. We're going to edit the waiting before. Okay. So welcome everyone. This is the first hybrid edition of the Talkboctopus Spring 2022 series. Today we have Dr. Albert Cow visiting us from UMass Boston, not too far, the next state over. Before I make the introduction, just going to make a few announcements. So this is the second talk this semester. We have 6 more exciting talks for the rest of the semester. Some of them are going to be in person in the hybrid format. Some other are going to be, some others are going to be strictly online. The next one is Hiroki Sayama, that's going to be visiting us from Binghamton University, actually, towards the end of March, and I think he's online.
Yeah, visiting right now.
Hey, hello, Hiroki. And so you can all get the information about those on our website, vermontcomplexsystems.org, as well on Twitter, UVM Complexity. As far as rules, the same rules as online apply in person, right? So the talk will be recorded and posted online. So if you don't want to appear on camera online, just keep your camera shut, and in person, the camera is directed in the front, so you should be good. After that, clarifying, so Albert uses the SFI rules of engagement. So if you have clarifying question, you can shoot them in the chat or in person. I will be monitoring the chat as we go. And also, this is a fun and inclusive space as always, so please be respectful. Okay. And then for our speaker today, so Albert is a recent assistant professor at the UMass Boston in biology and data science. He was previously a bird scholar and the Omidart Fellow at Santa Fe Institute, so 2 prestigious fellowship in complexity. Before that, a James S. McDonald Fellow, also another fellowship in complexity at Harvard, got his PhD from Princeton. And so he recently moved back to the Northeast at Boston, and we're really happy to have him in proximity to us. His work is on collective behavior across the spectrum, from like he's one of the first person that looked straight in my eyes, was very very candid about kind of talking about, oh, I'm going to write a model that applies to bisons, but also to bacteria in slime mold at the same time. And so very comprehensive and nice work across the spectrum of biology. So we're really excited to have him. His research was featured in Quanta. So we're really happy to have you. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. That was really nice. And it's awesome to be here. I've heard about this place for many years. Yeah, I've like a long history with some of the people here, like Laurent and Jean-Gab. I've known since our like JSMF days several years ago. And then we intersected at SFI several times. And so, yeah, I've heard a lot about this place, and it's really cool to be here in person and meet you guys and see the place like in person. Like, it's such a cool building, and I don't know, it seems like a really nice setup. And yeah, now I'm in Boston. I moved there 3 weeks ago, so I'm just brand new. Nothing's there yet. Although I did hire a postdoc, Helen McCreary, who is also a JSMF fellow. So, and I was just talking to John Gab, few SFI postdocs who are starting up faculty positions in the Boston area or like New England area. And so it feels like there's this, I don't know, momentum of complex systems in this area, which is really, really cool. So yeah, what Jean-Gab said, most of my research focuses on collective decision-making. And the way the way I define it is a consensus formed by some group of units, usually possessing different information or experiences towards some behavior or option in the environment. So I've defined this really broadly and really vaguely. And as Jean-Gab alluded to, it's on purpose so I can include a lot of different species and contexts. So Microscopically, you can think about, strands of bacteria deciding where to go next, or immune systems deciding whether or not to attack a foreign cell. Macroscopically, you can think about bird flocks or fish schools or herds of migrating ungulates or swarms of locusts. You can look underground at slime molds or fungal networks or plant roots. And across human societies, there's traffic patterns, swarm robotics, and obviously these global social media platforms. So I would argue that collective decision-making is ubiquitous. And so in my work, I try to ask two really broad questions in order to understand this phenomenon. The first is, why is it so common? So in other words, what benefits do individuals accrue from making decisions as a group? And under what conditions does it fail? And the second question is, how do these benefits arise? So in other words, what are the collective algorithms that can produce these improvements in decision accuracy? So I'd like to start off, and apologies if this is overly basic for some people in the audience, but with the Condorcet-Jury theorem, which is over 200 years old at this point. But I think it's important to start here because at least in the field of animal behavior, this theorem still is a major source of intuition for our predictions of social animal groups. So this is a really simple model. And what it says is that you take a group of individuals, so it could be this flock of birds, or in the original formulation, it was a jury of people. And they're trying to decide between two options. To say they're trying to decide between which of these trees to visit. And there's one objectively correct option. So this one has more fruit, so it's better. And so each individual forms an opinion about which of the two trees is better. And crucially for this model, they assume that these opinions are independent of each other, and that each individual has the same probability of forming an opinion for the correct option. So, and that probability is greater than 0.5. So they have some useful information, but it's noisy. And so with the binomial distribution, we can specify what is the probability that a certain proportion of the group has formed a correct opinion. And then if we further assume that a consensus decision is made by taking a majority vote amongst the opinions, then the probability that the group makes a consensus decision for the correct answer is just the integral of the distribution to the right of 0.5. Yeah.
Do you mind if we take a second to just minimize the zoom? If you go over to people's face, my face, and then click on the yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
Great. So you take the integral of the right side. And so as you increase group size, the probability that the group makes a correct decision increases monotonically, and this is what we traditionally call the wisdom of crowds. So it's a super simple model and gives us this really nice prediction. But if we compare this model to the examples that we looked at earlier, like bacteria, slime molds, fish, immune systems, plant roots, clearly there's a lot missing from the model. And so in my theoretical work, what I try to do is identify features of either these species or the environments or the context in which they're making decisions, incorporate them into the model, and see how the predictions of the model changes. And just to give a little bit of punchline, it often changes in really surprising and interesting ways. So for example, the Condorcet-Jury theorem assumed that these individuals formed opinions independently of each other. But it's clear that in nature, this is rarely the case. So for example, if we're like walking down the street and then we hear a gunshot, it's like, okay, we've all heard, this is like correlated information. We've all heard this stimulus, and we decided to not go in that direction. And that's an extreme example, but there's different levels of correlation in general when you're smelling odors or looking at visual information, especially if you're close together and you have similar views. So in this model, I try to pick that apart a little bit. So here, instead of sort of like one source of information, I assume there's two sources of information that these individuals have access to. The first source is the same as the Condorcet model, where everyone gets some like independent piece of information. The second source of information is highly correlated across the individuals. So it's like that really loud stimulus where everyone sees the same piece of information in a given trial. And then each individual chooses which piece of information to follow by choosing one probabilistically with some probability V. And then, like before, you combine these individual opinions into a consensus decision through majority rule. So it's the same model. We added a second Q that's highly correlated. So immediately, in contrast to the Condorcet prediction, where you get this monotonic increase in decision accuracy with group size, here you often find something different. You get this optimal group size. So large groups do not so good, and you get some like medium-sized group that does better. And if we look across, I'm not going to dive too deep into the model or the parameters, but if you look across parameter space and the colors represent the optimal group size, there is a region of parameter space, this like wedge, where you do get your classic wisdom of crowds. But for the majority of parameter space, you get this optimal group size, and the optimal group size tends to be relatively small. So this is interesting because if you just follow the intuition from the Condorcet jury theorem, as a lot of animal behavior researchers do, you would assume that these groups are getting some benefit from the wisdom of crowds. But if you see in nature that there's actually some optimal or some like finite group size in which these groups live, you would assume like, well, there's some cost to living in like super large groups. Like maybe there's competition for resources, and that's why we see like groups of 20. They're balancing this wisdom of crowds with competition. But this model suggests that maybe these groups are maximizing their decision accuracy. And in this case, where you have correlated information, these small groups are maximizing accuracy. And just to give like a little bit of a flavor of why you get this optimal group size, it's because noise can function in a good way and in a bad way in this scenario. So at very large group sizes, you get this voting block, which is the individuals that are following the correlated information. They're all voting exactly the same. And so even if they're a minority of the group, they can have a really powerful influence on the collective decision and sort of like dictate what the group decision is going to be. And by shrinking your group size, this sort of degrades the influence that that voting block has. So here, noise can actually improve decision making. And this is not my work, but other people's work have found similar results in other sort of contexts. So in this model, we have a group of individuals and they're making sequential decisions. So one goes first, then the next, then the next, and the next. And they can see the decisions of the ones that went before. So whereas in my model, I had correlations come in through the external environment, through the cues that they sense. But here, the correlations are generated through the social influence. But even so, they find this similar pattern of an optimal group size. And more recently, somebody else published a paper where it's similar to this one, where you have sequential decision making, but you're only looking at a subset of the previous decisions. And here he found that there's some optimal mean degree of connectedness, where if you're observing everybody, that's actually worse than if you observe only a smaller subset of previous decisions. And that optimal mean degree scales as the square root of n, which we'll become relevant soon. So in another model in which I was trying to like add features of natural systems into this Condorcet model, I was thinking about the assumption that consensus decisions are just made by majority rule. And if we look in nature, maybe that's not always the case. So if you look at a lot of animal groups, there's actually a lot of internal structure in groups. It might be like kin groups where you have family structure within this larger group. And so you might imagine that groups or decisions are formed, like consensus is formed within these smaller kin groups, and then it propagates outwards to the whole group. So this model incorporates that by splitting the group into discrete subgroups. Each subgroup makes a decision through majority rule, and then that propagates upwards. You can have as many layers as you want, where each layer makes its own decision through combining the decisions of the subgroups. And this is a toy example which shows that information can be lost when you have structure like this. So here we have 9 individuals, 5 have the opinion black, whatever that is, 4 have the opinion white. And then if you take the consensus of each subgroup and you propagate it forward, then the overall consensus is for white, even though at the start it was the minority opinion. And that's because at each step, the minority opinion in each subgroup is lost. So that like black opinion is no longer represented at higher stages of decision making. And so this is a toy example, but in general, I found that to be true, where if you have internal structure, it causes a loss of information. And in fact, it causes a loss of information such that a larger group with some sort of internal structure, whatever it is, behaves identically to a smaller group with no internal structure. So it basically like shrinks your effective group size. And since in the previous model, I showed that smaller group sizes can be beneficial for decision-making in a lot of contexts, this suggests that internal structure could be a strategy that animals evolve in order to improve their decision-making while still retaining a large actual group size, which could be important for, say, like predator deterrence. So if it's important to be big, to have a big group so you can fight off predators, but you want to improve your decision accuracy, then having some sort of internal structure can push you in that direction. And this is why I had the square root of n in the last slide, because I found something really similar in this paper where the optimal number of subgroups scales as the square root of n of the group size, which we haven't, I've talked to the previous author of the other paper and we haven't really figured out why that's the case, but it seems like there's something general going on there with the scaling. Yeah.
I kind of expected you to do an analogy with like political systems, because if I understand the model, isn't that like electoral college or parliament system in Canada, or
Yeah.
It's literally the electoral college.
yeah, and a parliament system.
I was thinking exactly the same thing of like applying it in to find the optimal like map. Like there is a lot of models that are currently we're looking for models that can detect gerrymandering.
Mhm.
And that would be like, this would be a great application for something like that, for finding new spatial maps.
Yeah, totally.
Because my question was going to be like, is that an interface of
Yeah.
models of collective decision making and like models of political system? Does that exist, like that multidisciplinary field?
To some extent, but I think it's still like
Hmm.
work to be done there. And also in other countries, so like in the US, there's 2 dominant political parties, but in other countries there's more. Yeah, and to what what are the implications of these results to the structure of other if you look across countries. That's a good point. I think about that more.
Okay, I was not thinking about the electoral college, but I was thinking about the chickens.
Uh-huh.
I have a lot of chickens. I have a high tolerance for roosters,
Mhm.
and my way of having a lot fewer rooster battles is having a bunch of different sort of geodesic dome coops where they can choose where they go.
Mhm.
And so it takes the sort of hierarchy, we will decide things in this particular thing, pressure off of them. And on the one hand, it's not, they have some internal structure in that they're, that they have, certain kinds of communications and also are known for having pecking orders, but it really relieves a lot of pressure on what would have otherwise been a very hostile system if I put them all in one place.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I just submitted a grant proposal that looks at, or it proposes to look at social structure across lots of different species, like birds and bats and dolphins and humans. And so, yeah, I'm excited to, I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but so this is a whole thread of theoretical models with very little empirical work to see what relevance does actually have in a lot of species. And so in my new lab, I want to do a lot more of that, of looking either across at existing data or getting field data or doing lab experiments to try to test these predictions, because I've just been generating like tons of predictions from these models, but when you're in a biology department, you want to know, like, this is actually like relevant to real animals. Yeah, so hopefully, well, it's interesting that you've like forced them into separate locations, but in this proposal, we're trying to look at the natural pecking order.
Yeah,
and-
I don't actually tell them what zone to go into.
Yeah.
They work it out in one zone.
Mhm.
I used to have like 3 or 4 of them. Now I just have 2, but that seems to be pretty stable.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I was thinking of the dolphins. I work with dolphins, and so that you can find groups of about 1,000 over sometimes 2,000, and just one group. That was one-
Dolphins?
Yeah, dolphins.
Well.
There's a species of dolphin in Central America that can form these megapods.
Wow.
And so what I was thinking is that if the effective group size for a decision can change depending on the context,
Mhm.
like it's not the same if you are making a decision as a group when you are figuring out where food is
Mhm.
to where, for example, noise
Mhm.
from traffic or, boat traffic or, finding mates. Because dolphins kind of have to coordinate their behavior, especially males, and how to access females. So it's the modular structure, I guess, that
Mhm.
optimal group size can change depending on the context.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, even like experimentally, it's often difficult to identify like what is the group size or what is the relevant group size. Like if you have a school of fish in a really big tank, you can define it in lots of different ways, such that you have like lots of small groups or you have one large group. So yeah, that's a really interesting point of that effectively individuals and groups could be dynamically changing their effective group size. Like it could look at like one group, but effectively it could be like many small groups sometimes or one large group sometimes, depending if like they're trying to evade a predator or look for food or look for mates. Yeah, that's really interesting. But also tricky, I think, to try to study that empirically. See if they, yeah, it's kind of like a question of how do you get into the mind of these animals? And like, how many neighbors are they paying attention to? Things like that. Any other questions? Okay. So the last model that I wanted to briefly talk about is the most recent one that we just submitted, where we're trying to take this model into the time domain, which is missing in the Condort model, but also in a lot of other models of collective decision making. So here, instead of just getting one piece of information and you form an opinion and you form some consensus, you're getting pieces of information like over time and you're accumulating some opinion. Sorry, I should be clear about this. So this is your opinion over time. And as you get pieces of information, you move up or down in opinion space. And once you hit some threshold, so here it's +1 or -1, then you've decided and you kind of like fix yourself at that opinion and you just wait for others to decide. And once everyone's decided, then you do your majority rule thing. So it's a drift diffusion model, except it gets complicated when you introduce correlations. So we have two kinds of correlations. You have spatial correlations, which is like the correlations that I talked about earlier, where everyone sees the same piece of information at each point in time, but across time it can be independent. Or you can have temporal correlations where each individual, the piece of information persists for some time scale before it gets updated, but every individual sees different information potentially. And you have information that's both spatially and temporally correlated. So just to map it so that there's a similarity to the previous models, here we had, again, two cues. So one is uncorrelated, and the other one has some sort of correlation, either spatial or temporal. And then we run the model, and the results are like quite confusing, so I'm not going to really talk about it. But the main, there's a main theme which is really interesting. And so in previous models, we talked about group size being a strategy that animals could exploit, or internal structure as a strategy that animals could exploit. Here we're thinking about the rate at which you switch attention between the two cues. And actually that can be quite a useful strategy. So if you have a cue that has temporal correlation, not switching your attention to cues has a beneficial effect. So like each individual should choose one cue and just fixate on that for the whole trial. But you actually see the opposites if you have spatial correlations. So if you have spatial correlations, then each individual should switch between cues really frequently. And that has a positive effect of negating the negative effects of correlation. And it's even stronger with the spatial correlation, where if you don't switch attention between the two cues, you get that optimal group size. And if you do switch attention, you kind of recover that classic wisdom of crowds monotonic increase. So yeah, this kind of, just to summarize this whole like body of models that I've been working on for the past few years, which is that the classic wisdom of crowds model, I think, gives us a poor intuition of what real animal groups are doing. Although, like I said earlier, we still need to test this empirically. And by adding in features of natural environments, it changes our predictions by a lot. In particular, correlations from different sources, whether it's external cues or internal social influence, can cause large groups to be suboptimal. But we've uncovered several strategies that individuals could use to counteract this, such as shrinking group size, introducing structure in the group, or changing the rate of switching attention between cues. And so this creates a lot of new hypotheses and predictions about the strategies that social animals could evolve in order to improve their collective decision making. So I think this gives like a much richer picture of collective decision making in nature. Yeah.
I think that's connected to something I was wondering. Do you mind going back to the previous slide? Because you showed some of those final results pretty quickly, but
yeah,
you were using language like should switch and whatnot. But is there, like, maybe I want my optimal group size to be small, and I want, like, it's good to have a negative effect of group size because there's also negative things associated with large groups. So I guess I'm wondering like how much like those negative effects should also be in these models. The fact that the large, if you look at with attention switching, it's great that larger group size are more accurate, but how would you like introduce something like resource sharing in a model like this, or like something to penalize other than just collective decision making?
Yeah, so that's one thing that, so it's a really good criticism of these models. So here I've been trying to sort of like unpack some of the assumptions and see what effect it has, but it still has a lot of strong assumptions that I've not yet unpacked. So one is say you have a consensus decision, and then the resource reward is like shared amongst the individuals in the group. But in this time model, you can imagine something different where you could have cheaters. So individuals could have their own threshold to say like, I set my threshold to be really low and I make a decision really quickly. And so I get out of there. And if I guess right, then maybe I get more of the food than someone else. And so there's this really interesting game that that animals could play to try to cheat their way into earning more rewards. I haven't really played around with that much at all, but it is a big part of the literature, especially in the 80s. There's a lot of game theoretic models of foraging in groups in social settings. And so incorporating that, it would be really interesting.
So my understanding is like there's a lot of different options for these, like this group size. Do you know how many situations of like what different starts of your model like give you all the different types of group sizes that you could get? Or is there a way to reverse engineer? Like I start and say I want to have a group size of this many. Like, can you go backwards and say what type of dynamics or what type of decision would come from that? Is there a way to do that? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't explain this very well. I kind of like rushed through it. But so in this model, you fix the group size.
Oh, okay.
In all the models, you fix the group size. And then you run, in all the models, you fix, say, all the parameters except for group size. And then you like run the model across group size, and then you get this. So there's not like a dynamic choosing of group sizes, although you could do that. And I have done some models where you can have some agency in like splitting off from your group, or you can combine groups, and then you get some distribution of group sizes, which could also be really interesting to incorporate. What's happening?
I'm keeping an eye on the
nice.
waiting room.
Okay, that's all for the theoretical work. And so I guess for the next few minutes, I just wanted to pivot towards sort of the future and the things I'm thinking about pursuing there, in case there's, I don't know, points of like shared interest amongst people here or online. So like Jean-Gab said, I've just started a new lab at UMass Boston, which if you guys know Boston, UMass Boston is this like square right here, like right on the water, which is also like a reveal where I live. So don't look at that. But yeah, so there's like this new like integrated sciences complex, which is quite nice. It seems like this building where it's like new and physics is there, chemistry is there, biology is there, and yeah, it's a really nice space to be in. And like I mentioned, I'm trying to not pivot, but try to incorporate more empirical work in order to have more of a balanced like interplay between the theory and data. So one of the organisms that I've studied starting from my postdoc is this slime mold, which I don't know if you guys know much about slime molds. They kind of look like a fungus. This is what one of them looks like in the forest. They're actually amoeba, not fungi. But like a fungus, it lives on the forest floor and it'll like move around eating like decaying material. It's technically single-celled, so this thing can be like quite large, but it's single-celled in the sense that this is all just like one interconnected network of like goo. But there's like many nuclei throughout the organism. And it dynamically shuttles around material throughout the network. And if you did like a time-lapse video, the whole thing like pulses, kind of like, I don't know, like a digestive system that like pulse, like push material around. And it can move quite quickly. So like a centimeter per hour, just like crawling around space.
Thomas in the chat says brainless also, correct?
It doesn't have a brain, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some people make that argument that it's been known to approximate like solutions to the traveling salesman problem. And so people have been trying to use this as an inspiration for algorithms to solve problems like that. So it does some things that appear like computational and smart, yeah, without having a like neuronal brain. So I built this rig with like a camera that moves around and can take pictures of different samples, and you can also apply different like chemical or light stimuli. And so you can produce movies like this. So this is a sample, but then I falsely color it by whether that part of the sample is actively like growing, or if it's stable, or if it's retracting. And then you can make videos like this, which I think look really cool. So yeah, sometimes when I think about it, it seems like these blue like new branches are hypotheses about where it could go. And it explores these hypotheses for some time before it gets like enough information of like, oh, we want to commit to this direction. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question to say compare a collective system like this slime mold to a collective system like a school of fish or a colony of ants, and look more generally at what are general principles of collective decision making. Like in which ways is a slime mold similar to an ant colony, in which ways is it different? And so yeah, John Gab was alluding to this in the introduction, where I like to think about like super diverse in terms of what we mean by collective systems, and try to think really broadly about general principles. So yeah, some of the questions I think about here are, where is information sensed? Is it all over the network, or is it just in these like blue tips? Where and how is information compared? And where are decisions made? Yeah, so since there's no brain, like the whole thing kind of functions like a brain. And so picking out where these different decision-making components are, I think is really interesting. Lastly, I wanted to show this video, which I took this past August in Alaska with Andrew Berdal, which I think some of you know. So we went there to study migrating salmon. So these red dots are salmon. And apologies, this video probably looks really crappy on Zoom, but it looks awesome in person. Yeah, so these little red dots are salmon, and so just a quick primer on the life history of salmon. So they're born in these small, shallow ponds, and then they go eventually out to the ocean to live for a few years. And at the end of the life cycle, they migrate back to these ponds, lay their eggs and reproduce, and then die. We like opportunistically filmed these grizzly bears trying to hunt the salmon. And then the white dots are gulls that are just like scavenging. And yeah, it's just like really cool to look at. And there's a lot of really interesting, yeah. No, no, this one's horrible. So we think that these are like fairly juvenile bears. There's this one, and there's a sibling that's kind of like off camera. But they seem really young and like really bad at catching salmon.
Is this on YouTube? I want to watch this.
This is on YouTube.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's also like beautiful how the salmon like reacts to the predator. It's so cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, one question is, how does social collective behavior allow these salmon to avoid this bear? And that's like not well studied, but it has been studied a bit, but not in such a naturalistic context. Like this is just like a pure, like wild nature context. They can also think about the converse question of, how can predators exploit collective behavior in order to better hunt them? So this young bear is horrible at it. But if you look at more mature bears, they're much better at corralling and cornering groups of salmon, and then like they can beach them, say like up there, and then just eat lots of them. Or if you've seen videos of bait balls in the ocean, like predators can corral groups of schooling fish and use really tight balls and then eat them really efficiently. So there's like this interplay, this coevolution between the strategies of the predator and strategies of the prey. And you can also think about social predators, so like prides of lions or whatever. So now you have social versus social in this like really complicated and interesting interaction. So this is, I think, a goal when we go back to Alaska this year is to try to target these bear videos and get a lot more of them to start to, and maybe like different age groups of bear if we can, and try to analyze. Yeah, can we quantify what their strategy is? Like it's clearly possibly complicated, and then see how it changes and they learn over time to better hunt. Yeah, so that's all I had. Just want to acknowledge co-authors on the work that I presented, and that's my email address in case you want to like chat about stuff after I leave. But yeah, thanks for listening, and if there's any more questions, feel free to ask.